invite you to turn with me to the Gospel of Luke chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. I had an interesting week, and with everything that's been going on in our family life, my personal life, I usually have a pretty loose command on timelines and time frames as it is, and that's just an honest confession. I'm not a very linear thinker, and so it doesn't take much to get me tripped up. But I knew my sister. It was no surprise. I knew Pastor Appreciation Sunday was coming up. I knew my sister was visiting that weekend, and then somehow in my mind, I just construed it that as soon as we got home from the retreat, my sister was going to be here the next weekend. So I'm thinking Pastor Appreciation Sunday is this Sunday. And it didn't dawn on me that the dates didn't line up. But so Renee just, messaged me because she hadn't heard from me about, music selections. And I said, well, I was under the impression that the elders were going to handle the music selection along with Pastor Appreciation Sunday. And then she texted me back a while later. She goes, you do realize that's next weekend, right? And then, it got even better because I had agreed to speak one night at a revival at Piney Grove, and that was like 6 months ago or more, and didn't get any kind of, usually when I would host a revival, I would send a message out a week and a half before, probably 2 weeks before, just to check with the messengers, make sure it was on the speakers, make sure it was on the radar screen. I got nothing, and Isaac got word through Nicole that I was preaching at their church Wednesday night. And I said, well, I better show up then. So it has been a crazy week. So I was kind of operating, scrambling from behind, coming up with a message this week. And then I just kind of had a block. I just couldn't figure out what I was supposed to say. Pastors are what we call leaky buckets. I don't know if you've ever heard that analogy, but we're like buckets with holes in them, and God pours into us, and then it overflows or goes through those channels into other people, and it really is troubling when we're empty. And I found myself at just an empty place, and I really do believe the Lord led me to this, and it's a message, a scripture we've looked at before. It's the parable of the shrewd manager, but I really feel like it's going to be a new message in light of where we're at, not only my family personally, but where we're at as a congregation as well, because I know all this affects you. So Jesus starts in Luke chapter 16. We'll be reading 1 to 13. It says, he also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And so he called him in, and he said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do since my master is taking the management away from me? He says, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. In verse 4, notice what he says. He says, I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said, take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, take your bill and write 80. The master, and this is the plot twist, verse 8. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. And listen to what Jesus says. He says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. One who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If you then have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. And I know the primary application of this is about money, but I want to just expand it to really stewarding all of the resources that God has given us. And I think it also drives home a really important message, and that is that our time on earth is limited. Our time on earth is limited. 1 Peter 1:24 says this: we are grass. Notice the descriptors of our lifetime in the Bible. 1 Chronicles 29:15 says we're like a shadow. Elsewhere, we're described in the Bible as a vapor, a mist, or a breath. Psalm 90:12 says, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And I just want to drive home, I think something that I think is really significant. Our hearts resist this. When we're young, we think we're immortal, invincible, right? We just think, and we just carry this inherent assumption, and that is that we have this great lifespan out before us. A number of years ago, and this was no accident, I think God led us in this direction. Before Donna was ever diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, we were listening to a younger pastor named Matt Chandler, who's at the Village Church in the greater Dallas area in Flower Mound, Texas. And he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. And Don and I really just hung in because we were really being challenged and ministered to in his post-cancer diagnosis sermons. And I remember there was a message where he stood in front of the congregation, and this was after, on Thanksgiving Day, he had a grand mal seizure and was rushed to the hospital, and they diagnosed him with an inoperable brain tumor after doing an MRI. And then he started treatment and then ended up back in the pulpit. And I remember that first Sunday back in the pulpit, he said, you and I are no different. That's what he said to the congregation. He said, the only difference is that of assumptions. He said, you assume you have your whole life out there before you, and I don't. That's a dangerous assumption, isn't it? None of us are promised tomorrow. We're not promised later today. And I think this parable drives home the importance of that message, that our time on earth is limited. And we shouldn't be so wasteful of our time. I think one of the things that I will cherish forever, these last 11 years of Donna's cancer battle, God has just underscored so many times the importance of seeing the blessings that come about each and every day. We spend so much time in our life pining for tomorrow or next week or next month or the next opportunity. And you know, when you're in the midst of unpleasant things, your gut reaction is to obsess with thoughts of how can I get out? How can I get out from under this? And I think maybe a better question you can begin to ask God and ask yourself is, what is God trying to teach me in the midst of all this? And that's been a very powerful lesson this last decade of my life. So we want to learn from the shrewd manager. And, you know, it's kind of ironic because here we have Jesus, this rabbi, and he's teaching primarily his disciples. You see some cues in the text that there are some onlookers. There's people listening in, notably the Pharisees. And I think Jesus really loved to mess with the Pharisees. He would include little wrinkles and details in his story, would just be a burr under their saddle, so to speak. I mean, And so can you imagine you're one of the Pharisees, and Jesus brings up this story about a dishonest manager, and then Jesus says, folks, you should be more like him. Right? Imagine I stood up and the gist of my message one Sunday is to bring up Bernie Madoff and say, you should be more like him. That really might rub you the wrong way. So, and actually, when I first started researching this passage, I went to the commentaries, and all the commentators really struggled with this, because this is a bad man, And they almost wanted to put this little caveat, this little warning, no, there's only certain aspects of this that Jesus is calling us to imitate. And I think that's right. But in every one of Jesus' parables, there's this unexpected irony, this plot twist, so to speak, that just kind of arrests you. And I think the greatest plot twist in this parable is that the hero of the story is a dishonest manager. Shrewd manager, more rightly so. And you might think, and I'm sure the Pharisees are thinking this, how can the Lord commend a criminal? In verse 14, it says, when the Pharisees overheard this, they ridiculed him. And notice Luke gives us an interesting clue as to why. Because they were lovers of money. What's interesting is that the poor, the humble, the lowly who were in Jesus' hearing, they probably wouldn't have been too bothered by this message because they didn't have any money to be mismanaged, right? And the Pharisees, they had great sums of money. But Jesus is employing a teaching pattern that we see throughout his parables. We see this a lot in Jesus' parables. And the teaching pattern here is called from the lesser to the greater. From the lesser to the greater. So Jesus he's not really holding up this shrewd manager as virtuous. But what he's saying is, if a shrewd manager will do this, how much more should the sons and daughters of God want to arrange the details of their lives, which is limited, so that they can make much of eternity, which is forever. And that's the point that Jesus makes. So we go kind of point by point. Just a couple other examples from the lesser to the greater. You remember the story of the unjust judge? The woman goes to the judge and she pleads with him for justice, and he won't hear her. And then she keeps going back, and he finally relents, right? And Jesus says, if an unjust judge will do this, how much more will your Father in heaven? Or the neighbor that goes to his neighbor's house at night asking for help, how much more will your Father in heaven hear your pleas for help? Or he says, which of you, earthly fathers, if your son asked him for a fish, would give him a serpent? If your son asked you for a loaf of bread, would you give him a stone? And he said, if you, earthly fathers who are born into this world with a sin nature, will do good things for your children, how much more will your Father in heaven do good things for those who ask of him, right? So Jesus is pointing to lesser examples to contrast them with the greatness and virtue of God. So we go back kind of to the crux of the parable. Verse 1, the manager is found to be wasteful. Verse 2, he's fired on the spot, and he's left to settle accounts. And years ago, when it was after 2008 when the whole building trades, everything collapsed, and I was in kitchen and bath cabinetry, and I was looking for work. And God provided that I could go into aviation cabinetry, and I worked for a place called Savannah Air Center in Savannah, Georgia. And it was kind of a strange environment. You're working on $60 million jets, and So obviously there's a lot at stake. And what I began to realize, every once in a while, we would see members of management come out onto the floor in the hangar, and they would be accompanied by security guards. They'd go up to a guy that was working, and they'd say, pack up your tools. And they would watch as he packed up his tools, and they would walk him out. And he had to call somebody to help him load his toolbox into his truck or make arrangements. They gave you no notice. Because there's an important lesson here. When you're working on $60 million jets, you don't want to keep somebody in your employ who has an axe to grind, right? You don't want anybody that would sabotage the project or sabotage the aircraft. And so the Lord started leading us we ended up moving up to Virginia to a Christian campground there where I became the camp manager. And I was talking to some coworkers, they said, don't give your notice. As soon as you give your notice, they're going to let you go. So I worked right up. That was really uncomfortable for me because I've always given at least 2 weeks notice in a job. And I worked right up until my last day. I was getting the moving truck the next morning. And I went to my manager at the end of the day and I said, hey, this will be my last day. And he goes, oh, Mike, I would have let you work out notice. And some of my friends were like, no, they wouldn't have, So, and we had a phrase for that. It's called walking them out, But this rich landowner, he didn't do that. He actually gave this money manager time to wrap up the books. And that's probably an important lesson, right? If you're ever going to fire somebody, don't let them be in charge of your books still, right? And so what the manager does is he calls in the debtors, the people that owe his master money, and he begins to forgive a portion of their debt. What's he doing? Well, he's getting in the good graces of these other people so that when his job is over, he can call on them, It's like, hey, I did you a solid, now you do me a solid, right? And he could call on them and he would be in their good graces. And Jesus wants us to understand that our time here on earth is limited. And, you read the Bible cover to cover and you realize the Bible doesn't say much on how to lengthen your life. There's probably some health tips, The Bible actually, believe it or not, doesn't say a whole lot about the afterlife. There's a lot of that that's veiled in mystery, right? Paul says we see through that glass dimly. So if the Bible doesn't tell you how to extend your life and the Bible doesn't tell you what's next entirely, what does the Bible focus on? Well, what the Bible focuses on is how to leverage your time on earth in light of eternity. Makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you breathe your last breath, it's too late to get your affairs in order. And so what the Bible wants us to do is to take the resources that God has blessed us with in this world and to leverage them for eternity. So that's exactly what the shrewd manager does. He says, I know what I'll do, and he begins to forgive the bills of these different people so that when everything's said and done, he will be received into good graces. I think the key verse in all of this is verse 8. Jesus says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So Jesus is like, the wicked, worldly people around you, they're shrewd. They have this limited, finite mentality, and they're fighting tooth and nail, right? And Jesus commends the manager not for being dishonest, not for ripping his master off, but for acting shrewdly. The word shrewd means taking careful advantage of the resources at hand for a desired end result. Listen to what John MacArthur said in his commentary. He said, the point's pretty direct, isn't it? A typical, sinful, self-protective, conniving, maneuvering businessman acts for his own future benefit in a way that is very clever and ingenious, using the resources at his disposal with shrewdness to secure the future that he wants. And Jesus says, how much more shall the children of God do this. If worldly people go through all this trouble to secure temporary fortunes that don't outlast the second date on their tombstone, how much more should God's people invest their time, their abilities, their money, their resources, their lives with eternal goals in mind? You're powerless to extend your life, but one thing that you have in your power today is to choose how you're going to spend the remainder of your time here on earth. You read through Hebrews 11 and just great contrasts, you know. Some rout foreign armies, you know, open the mouths of lions, stare death in the face, and then the writer of Hebrews just turns instantly. He says, and some are sawn in two. But none of these, he says, received the promise that they had in store, so that apart from us, in verse 39, they would not be made perfect. So the point of life is that all of us are marching toward an end, and what we do with our time here on earth makes a huge difference in light of eternity. I asked a few people. I felt like the Lord stirred me to do this morning. We've had a number of folks come in to visit us, and we have more coming in the coming week. And I just asked a few people, in light of our time together that you've spent with our family in the last week, what seems more important to you and what seems less important to you? And here were some of the answers. And these are in no random order. One, what seems more important, spending time in prayer and worship, studying God's word and his teachings, raising our children in a Christian home that is safe and loving. Somebody said, snuggling my kids more. So I think, especially when you're a young mom and you feel like you're drowning in obligations and messes, it's easy to just, you know, have your nose to the grindstone. And this person said, I need to get my toddler, when she comes to me for a hug, just hold her on my lap. Family game nights, telling people that are close to you that you love them. Attending and using your gifts and abilities in a Bible-believing church. Spiritual conversations, not conversations of the mundane. These are all more important. Maintaining a healthy lifestyle. More important, being responsible and organized with finances. More important, keeping an eye on my family and not getting swept up in the worries of this world. There's a lot of stuff out there that we can't control, and I think sometimes especially if you watch a lot of cable news, you start to just get engulfed in that, and it can feel overwhelming. Somebody said sunsets, beautiful trees, the ocean, memories, making memories, worshiping as a family, worshiping together, laughter, and another one that really jumped out at me is my hope in Jesus. Another one, maintaining a good testimony in our lives, sharing with others the good news of the gospel and what the Lord has done in our personal life. Spending time with loved ones, enjoying fellowship. Here's some of the things that seem less important after this visit. Housework. It'll always go undone, right? There's always more. School. Time restraints. Entertainment. That can be TV, social media, the news, social media, phone, Facebook. What a stealer what a thief of our time, right? Worrying about what other people think. Your enemies are not going to bother to gather around you when everything's said and done. Don't let them control your life. And then there's also, somebody pointed out to me a number of years ago, there's also, there's like a percentage of the population, let's call them a third, that you'll never please them. There's a third of the population, they'll always love you and be happy with you. And then I think the middle third, they have pretty reasonable expectations. Don't let that 1/3 that are impossible to please govern how you live. Appearance, things like weight, height, aging, not that important. Being jealous of the things that other people have. Other people's drama, a whole lot less important. Material gain, a whole lot less important. Grudges, anger toward others. Worrying about money or problems. Those things are less important. Working too much, not maintaining time for God, for family, and for friends, and hoarding your time only for yourself. Not very important. And then also not sharing your financial blessings with others. So I appreciate those answers. I know I put some people on the spot, but I wanted to hear what they had to say, So all these things seem far less important, when we consider the brevity of life. I think another conversation I had this week was if I had to go through the last few years of COVID and everything else, what I would do differently. And I think I'm happy, I'm satisfied largely with how I lived my life. I probably wouldn't have done the 2 weeks to flatten the curve. I would have never canceled church service. But, one thing that jumped out at me is like we spent, especially the front end of these last 2 to 3 years, just kind of hunkered down, isolating from one another. You were made to believe by the media that people you didn't know were a pariah, a contagion. And some of that was probably cautious and rightly so, but the vast majority of the people that I found that caught COVID, they caught it from people that they see every day, family members, loved ones, coworkers. So, if I would have all this to do over again, and I would just challenge us as a congregation, don't worry so much about losing your life. Focus on living. Focus on living. That's what the Bible puts its focus on. The greatest tragedy in life is not a short life, but a wasted one. Let that sink in. And don't focus so much on temporary things that you overlook eternal things. And I've said this plenty of times. Temporal things are visible, right? They're tangible. No wonder they clamor for our attention. But some of the most important things in life are unseen, are eternal. And it's easy to neglect those things because we can't see them. And certainly the world around us doesn't clamor for us to deal with those things. Jesus would have us to understand this morning that the point of life is not trying to control the number of days that you have on this earth, but actually leveraging your time here on earth for eternity. And I'm going to share a quote with you from Jim Elliot. Most of you have heard it. January 8th, 1956, Jim Elliot, Nate Saint, Ed McCully, Peter Fleming, and Roger Youderian were attacked and speared to death by a group of Huaorani warriors in Ecuador while trying to reach the village with the message of the gospel. And it was tragic. The whole nation saw what unfolded and was mourning with these families. And then I don't know how quickly this came up, but a short time there later, a journal entry by Jim Elliot, I believe, it was one of the four men, was produced. And it was from October 28th, 1949, so just a few months prior to their death. And the journal entry was a reflection of this scripture. And it said this: one of the greatest blessings of heaven is the appreciation of heaven on earth. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. Luke 16:9, that when it shall fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The End of the Spear, or there's more of a documentary type movie called Into the Gates of Splendor. But because of the death of those 4 men, that village was reached with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and a powerful lesson on grace and forgiveness. An indelible lesson was made on those people. And actually one of the perpetrators of that act of violence became an indigenous missionary to his own people. And there are many people in that village today that believe the gospel because of the sacrifice of those men. And they did the math. They recognize God is calling me to give up the one thing that I cannot keep, the one thing that I cannot control, so that I might gain something that I could never lose. And that is wonderful math. But it's not intuitive to the people of this world. So Jesus said, maybe you should act a little more shrewdly and think of the manager. Our closing hymn is one that I hadn't heard us sing in a while. I'm not sure if we've sung it. Have we sung it? It's been a long time. But if you've not received Jesus as the Savior and Lord of your life, I want to just invite you this morning to come receive him. The altar is always open. If you don't know what if you don't have this assurance that when you stand before God in judgment someday, that he'll let you into his eternal kingdom, you can come forward today, and I would be glad to counsel with you, pray with you, and explain what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And for the rest of us, I hope that today is just a reminder of what's important, what's good, and just God calling our attention away from the things of this world, the cares of this world.